There are indications that the fundamental strategy governing the relationship between the United States under Donald Trump and Canada may be shifting rapidly, potentially altering long-held assumptions about cross-border political and economic dynamics. What appears to be unfolding is not merely another trade dispute or political disagreement, but a significant test of whether traditional pressure tactics remain effective. A critical interpretation suggests that Trump's established Canada strategy, often dependent on leverage and escalating costs to force concessions, is facing substantial pressure. This shift is reportedly driven by the emergence of Mark Carney, or at least the political and economic logic now associated with him, who is perceived by some observers as having changed the operational landscape. Historically, the assumption behind Trump-style international pressure has relied on a strategy built on asymmetry, spectacle, and the use of market and military size to ensure obedience. The effectiveness of this approach, which utilizes fear and confusion, depends heavily on the target accepting a subordinate role. However, if the target rejects this frame and instead decides to reprice risk, rewire alliance structures, and recalibrate financial exposure, the mechanism of pressure can begin to fail mechanically and irreversibly. This may be the transition currently being observed in the US-Canada relationship. Trump's strategy toward Canada, often characterized by tariffs, threats, public insults, or pressure campaigns, relies on an image of Canada as a junior partner with no choice but to accept Washington's terms. It assumes the United States can absorb pain more easily than Canada, and that Canada's business class, political establishment, and public opinion will fracture under duress. The emerging counterpositioning by Ottawa, potentially catalyzed by Carney, challenges this paradigm. Carney is recognized, not in a mythologized sense, but for what he represents to markets, institutions, central bankers, global investors, and technocrats on both sides of the border. Fluency in systems, credibility under stress, and command of the language of capital, risk, and international coordination. When a confrontation moves beyond political theater and into realms such as financial credibility, supply chain durability, and alliance architecture, the kind of figure Carney represents can alter the rules. While Trump's advantage has often lay in forcing opponents into an arena of speed, dominance, and headline warfare, Carney's potential strategic advantage involves slowing the tempo, changing the metrics, and shifting the focus from slogans to consequences, capital flows, and borrowing costs. The core of the current tension lies in a fundamental shift in how political power is being exercised and resisted. Modern political power is no longer strictly political. It is financial, psychological, diplomatic, logistical, and informational. While one side may continue to rely on brute pressure, the building of a layered defense across these 5 dimensions can initiate a countdown for the aggressor rather than the defender. In plain language, if Canada successfully convinces global markets that it possesses a credible long-term response, the cost of threatening the nation rises. By signaling to international allies that this is more than a bilateral dispute, the diplomatic price of aggression increases. Furthermore, if Canadian leadership can maintain domestic support by framing temporary economic pain as a necessary step to prevent permanent subordination, the political cost of resistance falls. A critical turning point occurs when business leaders begin to price in uncertainty regarding Trump's strategy rather than assuming Canadian capitulation. This migration of leverage is the central development of the current standoff. Figures like Mark Carney matter because they embody a calm, system-literate, and internationally legible response that can transform a pressure campaign into a self-inflicted wound for the initiator. Once markets suspect that a threat will not yield a quick concession, the focus shifts from how much Trump can force to how much instability the situation will create. This question is currently circulating through boardrooms, pension funds, export councils, and currency markets, weakening the effectiveness of the initial pressure strategy. The clash also highlights the contrasting personas at the center of the drama. Donald Trump operates as a nationalist strategist and pressure negotiator who believes that asymmetry is destiny. He utilizes raw force, repetition, and media dominance to overwhelm slower-moving institutions, thriving on confrontation and the use of unpredictability as a strategic asset. He seeks to keep counterparts off balance and elites uncertain, though this balance remains delicate. Conversely, Carney projects the image of elite institutional trust and crisis management. His influence is rooted in redefining the incentives behind the scenes rather than dominating the camera. He understands that confidence determines whether capital remains in a country, whether prices hold, and whether allies remain committed. When these two logics collide, spectacle versus stability and coercion versus credibility, the consequences are far-reaching. The first major implication for the Canadian public involves direct impacts on the cost of living, mortgage sensitivity, job security, and export exposure. Industries ranging from manufacturing and energy to agriculture and banking are already within the blast radius of this confrontation. Small business owners face fluctuations in input costs and currency moves, while pension funds monitor whether markets treat these events as a passing shock or a structural repricing. In the United States, the impact is equally significant, as integrated supply chains do not respect political boundaries. Energy flows, auto parts, and labor linkages mean that a strategy intended to punish Canada can adversely affect American producers, workers, and border states already grappling with inflation and geopolitical fragmentation. The strategic maneuvering observed in the current standoff suggests a significant reframing of the conflict. The central question has shifted from whether Canada can endure pressure to whether the United States can sustain the consequences of failed pressure. This transition tests American business patience and market tolerance for disruption. If this reframing holds, the US administration ceases to be the sole actor setting the tempo of the dispute and becomes one participant in a larger system that generates its own feedback loops. Markets and supply chains operate on incentives rather than rhetoric. If risk premiums jump or numbers deteriorate, the original strategy may collapse through a process of repricing, delayed investment decisions, and domestic backlash from constituencies experiencing rapid economic pain. Beyond the immediate mechanics of trade and political negotiation, this event serves as a potential blueprint for how middle powers and allied states might survive an era of high-pressure politics. The architecture of coercion functions primarily when resistance is perceived as futile. By demonstrating that disciplined economic statecraft, credible financial signaling, and allied coordination can blunt raw pressure, Canada may be establishing a model that other nations in Europe, Asia, and Latin America will study. This moves the international order toward a focus on institutional endurance and spreadsheets over ideology and speeches. It also addresses a fundamental question regarding the future of the international order, whether it will be organized around impulsive domination or if credibility and mutual dependence will continue to act as restraining forces. Analysts currently identify two primary paths forward for the bilateral relationship. The first involves a return to stability, where cooler heads recognize the compounding costs of escalation. In this scenario, Canadian leadership maintains internal unity, while the US administration accepts limits to its pressure tactics. Business leaders and allies would push for a stabilization of supply chains, allowing both sides to claim partial victory and retreat from the edge of a trade war. The second, more volatile path involves intensifying threats, expanding countermeasures, and a normalization of economic retaliation. This cycle would lead to permanent fragmentation, with a long-standing assumption that North American integration is too valuable to rupture begins to dissolve, resulting in a scenario where neither side achieves its strategic objectives and both suffer significant economic damage. Regardless of the immediate outcome, observers note that the trust underlying the US-Canada relationship has been fundamentally altered. The realization that a country must build defenses against the strategic volatility of its closest partner creates a structural shift that is difficult to reverse. The emergence of a strategy built on credibility, discipline, and market fluency signals that the relationship may never return to its previous state. The coming weeks will determine whether Washington adjusts its approach or doubles down, whether Canadian unity can be sustained under prolonged pressure, and whether this moment marks a temporary rupture or a permanent redesign of how allied nations interact with American power in the 21st century. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications for continued coverage of these historic developments.